This is Grandmaster Boris Alterman and you're watching Gambit Guide. Started a new series of lectures about the Goring Gambit, or as we call it, the Scotch Gambit. So after e4 and e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4. So we are going into the very, I would say, interesting the outcome of the Scotch opening line after e takes d4. In that position we are studying in our previous lectures the bishop c4 line, which after knight f6 could lead to the classical two knights defense. After bishop c5 somehow it could lead to the quite sharp lines with short castle knight f6 and e4 e5. However, instead of bishop c4 or knight takes d4, which is a classical Scotch opening line, which becomes very popular after Kasparov played it in his World Championship match against Anatoly Karpov in 1990, the other move just deserves our attention, as this is a c3 move. So white is going to sacrifice a pawn, and after d takes c3, instead of going with the course of the Danish Gambit, which we just already studied in our lectures, after bishop c4, which allows black to capture another pawn with c takes b2 and bishop takes b2, and white has quite serious compensation for the material deficit. White could just capture on c3 immediately and get quite a good development, but just for 1 pawn down. So this position after knight takes c3 we call the Goring Gambit or the Scotch Gambit, and these opening lines still very popular on the intermediate and beginner levels, and even I found a few players who use it quite successfully even on master and even grandmaster level. So what compensation white has for his sacrificed pawn? Of course, this is a quite serious difference from the Danish Gambit, because with the knight on c3, white has, I would say, more control over the d5 square, but his dark square bishop never goes to b2 in these lines. Indeed, white is continuing with the same course like in the Danish Gambit. It means that we are bringing the bishop to c4, looking towards the weakest spot in black's position, the f7 pawn. The queen d1 to b3 always is a great opportunity for white just to increase the pressure over the f7 pawn. Because knight on c3 is controlled so good the d5 square and e4 square, so white could have the opportunity to push the pawn after e4, e5. Already, after knight takes c3, we can understand that it's not so simple for black to develop his pieces. For instance, after knight f6, bishop c4, and bishop c5, white has quite unpleasant e4, e5 move. In that case, it's not so clear where to go with the knight on e5. Move like queen e7, not going to solve any of the black's problems after short castling. So clearly that capturing on e5 will lead to the immediate disaster. With rook e1, white is using quite well known the tactical resource when both king and the queen are on the same file, and after rook e1 the queen is pinned, the game is over. And if after short castle black is moving his knight away, let's say to g8, then white is just getting huge advantage by playing knight d5 or even by playing bishop g5. The position is really tough for black. So it means that it's a big difference from the Danish Gambit, where more or less black has a few opportunity with bishop b4 check or d6 or knight c6. Here, black has to make the decision immediately after the white captures the pawn on c3. And I could tell you that move like d6 after bishop c4, once again black has to be very careful. Let's say bishop e7 would be met by queen b3, and pawn f7 just cannot be protected anymore. After knight e5, knight takes e5, d takes e5, and bishop takes f7, clearly that white is having just huge advantage. Black's king lost the castling right, so white just continue his attack when all black pieces just on the very bad positions. So one of the typical ideas when you have material advantage, it's good to exchange pieces. So black could follow this principle by playing bishop b4. Indeed, after bishop c4, once again you have to be very, very careful. In the game between Alexandra Korolenko and Elizaveta Paradovskaya from the under 10 Ukrainian championship, so these two girls played this position, the game finished very fast by knight f6. And here after e5, black played very inaccurate move, knight e4, trying to use the pin of the knight on c3, but the knight e4 is a serious blunder, and I believe that you can find it very fast if you already studied my previous lecture and understand that control over the center usually allows white additional tactical opportunities. So when we look at the white's queen, that pawn on f7 and knight on e4 both, I would say, unprotected, because pawn on f7 is protected by only king and already attacked with white's bishop. So the simultaneous attack on these two targets would bring white decisive material advantage. Queen d5 move ruins black's position. So black cannot save his knight on e4 because the threat queen takes f7 is a checkmate threat. So after short castling and queen takes e4, black just has to resign. So the similar situation could happen in case when black is not developing his knight to f6 but plays knight g to e7, which also happened in some Willingen Open tournament in 2005. After knight g5, black played knight e5, bishop b3. So you can ask why after knight g5 we are not castling. Same reason. h7 and f7, both pawns could be simultaneously attacked with white's move queen h5. And there is no way to escape from the decisive attack. Let's say after h6 and knight takes f7, black is under mating threat, should capture rook takes f7 and just get into the losing position with queen takes f7. And after knight e5, bishop b3, h6, bishop f4. So once again, black's position is very, very unpleasant. Knight g6 will be met by knight takes f7. So this way game finished. And if you play knight g6, that even I can suggest here also knight takes f7 idea, and then to bring the queen to h5. So after knight e5, the other opportunity for white to continue attack could be even the move like immediate queen b3. So we cannot capture instantly on f7 after knight takes f7, knight takes f7. Black cannot immediately capture the knight king takes f7, since after queen b3 the bishop is gone. But black has just intermediate move. Bishop takes c3, and after b takes c3, king takes f7 is not so clear if white has enough compensation for sacrificed piece. So, still, bishop b3, h6. I would suggest, even instead of bishop f4, just simply to move the pawn. After f4, h takes g6 and f takes e5. Still, white is intending just to go with the short castling. f7 is a serious target. At the same time, white is threatening, as I explained before, bishop takes f7 with the force coming queen b3, and the bishop on b4 is hanging. So white is having just great opportunities in this position. So don't forget also that pawn on g5 is under threat of white's dark square bishop. So one more miniature happened in the game between Akaki Iashvili and Lopez Javier from the Blitz tournament played in 2004. And this game continued the bishop c4, knight f6. White played short castling and black answered d6, allowing white to bring the knight to d5. So knight d5 is quite unpleasant position for black after that move, since after knight takes e4, black is losing the piece almost by force. Can you find it? Knight takes b4. Knight takes b4. Now once again double attack. So forking the two knights with the queen. So you're playing queen e1, at the same time attacking the knight on e4 and knight on b4. And after d5, queen takes b4, d takes c4. White just simply plays rook e1, and it's easy to understand that black just cannot survive this position. It's a game between Georgic and Djokovic from the Marburg Open Tournament 1992. After queen d3, white creates a mating threat with bishop g5 and f6 immediately met by rook takes e4, queen takes e4, and after rook e1 there is no way to survive. Black just losing his queen with no any compensation. But let's back to the Iashvili against Lopez Javier game, which continued knight d5, after which black just simply decided to exchange on d5 and play knight takes d5, which is very serious mistake. So how to capture on d5 with the bishop, with the queen, or with the pawn? So it's quite obvious that queen takes d5 creates the threat of the mating f7. Indeed, after bishop e6 or even short castling, the position is quite far from being clear. So black just destroy white's immediate threats against his king. The move like bishop takes d5 is also doesn't achieve any sin after short castling. The only strong move in this situation is e takes d5, just sends away the knight from c6 and leaves the b4 bishop once again unprotected. So strangely enough, after e takes d5, the game is over. Black cannot save his dark square bishop. Move like knight a5 or knight e7 leads to the queen a4. Once again, very typical tactical trick. Helps white just to achieve the material advantage. So after e takes d5, black just cannot save the game anymore. For instance, after knight e5 and knight takes e5, same idea, queen a4 decides the game. So in 1914, one of the greatest players of the 18th century, Karl Schlechter, played against Karl Gromadka, the also quite well-known, the Czech player, in Baden-Baden tournament. Next opening line: e4, e5, d4, e takes d4, bishop c4. So now you can see that with a different moves order, we are getting into the standard position of the Goring Gambit or Scotch Gambit. And here after bishop c5, he played immediately c3. So by d takes c3, black is accepting the classical variation. Knight takes c3, d6. So this is absolutely the same position as if we would start the game with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, e takes d4, c3, d takes c3, knight takes c3, and after bishop c5, bishop c4, black would play d6, which would lead to the similar, absolutely same position. So after d6, black would like to play knight f6. Then after short castling, just to keep developing with the bishop to g4 or to e6, destroy all white's aggressive, I would say, opportunities, and just start realizing his material advantage. So it means that white has to be in hurry in such a position and has to find immediate the targets in black's position. Queen b3. It's a classical move for just different open variations as Evans Gambit, Danish Gambit, Goring Gambit, and also here we use it Queen d7. So once again, black would like to bring the knight to f6 and just to make the short castling. So white once again has to play very aggressively, knight to d5. Just prevents black from playing knight f6. After knight e7, we create additional threat on black's position, queen c3. The point of this move is that after knight takes d5, white cannot recapture the knight after e takes d5. Since our queen and the king on the same diagonal, and this would allow black just to win the game after bishop b4. The point of knight d5 move is that after knight takes d5, white has intermediate queen takes g7, attacking the rook on h8. And because the rook is hanging, rook f8 is necessary, so now white could continue his attack. Also with bishop takes d5, but also with very tempting move bishop h6, which puts black in the critical position. So that's why the knight d5, after knight e7 and queen c3, black has to solve his problems, and it's not so easy. Short castling, so white is also castling short side, and after knight g6, b4, bishop b6 and a4, white got just very promising position for just 1 pawn. So knight on d5 extremely strong. White is intending to bring the bishop to the long diagonal, finally to b2. Continue creating threats against black's king side. After knight c to e5, knight takes b6, a takes b6, and bishop b2, king h8, and b4, b5, Karl Schlechter kept quite interesting compensation here for the sacrificed pawn. The game continued, knight takes f3, queen takes f3, knight e5, queen g3, intending f4. So right now knight cannot capture on c4, of course, because g7 pawn cannot be protected anymore. So look at the white's bishop on b2, which is working over the long diagonal. After f6 and bishop b3, white is still continuing his attack on the king side, keeping two bishops advantage. And despite the fact black is having the extra pawn, it's quite difficult to play with black pieces here. So Karol Gromadka cannot develop easily his bishop from c8, so he is trying to exchange the queens after queen g4. But after queen e3, bishop d7, rook a to c1, c6, and f4, it becomes very clear that white's compensation here is just more than enough. after knight f7, white played simply rook f3, c takes b5, a takes b5, rook a to c8, rook takes c8, bishop takes c8, and because white creates so many threats on the king side, so black were forced to move all his pieces there, somehow it creates a lot of weaknesses in the center and on the queen side, which white just start collecting after queen takes b6. Queen d7 and change the front of the attack, rook c3. Suddenly rook is coming from the c file to the 7th rank. Queen e8, bishop d5. The other pawn is now on the thread, the b7 pawn. Bishop d7. Rook came to the 7th rank, rook c7. Black has no time for capturing the pawn on b5 because his f7 knight is hanging. So after bishop takes f7, rook takes f7, and rook takes f7, black cannot capture on f7 because the b5 bishop is on the air. So after knight d8, Schlechter finished the game quite elegantly with queen takes d6, bishop takes b5, and as we know in the open situations, the two bishops advantage usually is a decisive factor, and here is saying white bishops are extremely active, and the next move, bishop a3, just calls it a day for black. The rook cannot be protected anymore and cannot move, of course, with the rook to g8 because white's bishop from d5 is controlling the g8 square. So this extremely interesting game played by one of the strongest players of the 19th century, Karl Schlechter. As I would like to remind you that Karl Schlechter played one of the most, I would say, interesting World Championship match against Emanuel Lasker and made a draw in this match, leading almost by one point almost up to the last game. Just quite brilliantly used his advantage in this game against Karen Hromadka. And if we look at the opening part of the game, after queen c3, you can ask, okay, if really black is having so many problems with his king side protection, maybe just better immediately to play f6. And this f6 move was tested in the game between Penrose and Green in the Plymouth tournament 1957. So after f6 and short castling, it becomes clear that it's not so easy to solve the problems even in such a situation. Black king cannot castle, of course. After knight e5, knight takes e5, f takes e5, white has extremely strong move bishop e3. So by trading the already developed black pieces, white just gained more development advantage. Since black just left with all the bad pieces, king cannot castle, rooks are not connected, the bishop on c8 very passive, and also where to move the queen from d7. After knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, c6, and bishop b3, white is still intending to play f4. Black's king stuck in the center. In case of bishop takes e3, of course we would capture with the f pawn and open the additional opportunity for our rook to reach the 7th rank. So green played here queen e7, but even now, after bishop takes c5, d takes c5, and f4, his position very, very unpleasant. b6, rook a d1, bishop e6, and after queen takes e5, and bishop takes b3, queen takes e7, and a takes b3. So white got just quite serious advantage in the endgame, where his 2 pawns in the center, of course, much more dangerous than black's extra pawns on the queen side, which are double, and just cannot create easily here the pass pawn. So the Penrose realized his advantage on the move 41, but once again showed that it's not so easy to play with black pieces in the Scotch Gambit. In our next game, I would like to show you a quite brilliant play from Alexander Alokhin in his game against Klotas from the 1943 tournament. And in general, Alexander Alokhin, who was world champion, used to play the Goring Gambit quite often. And from his already quite early age, when he developed his tactical talent, we can find his, I would say, quite historical match game against the Soviet Union first champion Boris Verlinsky, and other games which were quite typical for developing of the theory of the Goring Gambit in that years. So in the second lecture about the Goring Gambit, I would like to show you the great games played by fourth world champion Alexander Alokhin, who started to use the Goring Gambit from the very early age in his chess career, and up to the 1943 when he beat in the Gien tournament the player with the name Klotas. And in his brilliant chess career, Alexander Alokhin used, of course, different opening lines, but it's no doubt that Goring Gambit or Scotch Gambit was part of his great weapons against the open games after e4, e5. Thanks everybody for watching. If you have any question and request, you can leave me a message on ICC and follow my Gambit guy on Chess FM. Thanks everybody, and see you next time.